Picture this. A man in a black tuxedo,
bow tie hanging loose around his open collar,
running across a gravel parking lot at 11 o'clock at night.
dress shoes slapping against the ground. Behind him, through the glass doors of a converted vineyard barn, 200 guests are standing frozen,
Forks still in hand,
watching him disappear into the dark. Somewhere behind him, a woman is calling his name, but he doesn't stop.
He doesn't even look back. That man was Ethan Bennett.
2 hours earlier,
He had just married the woman he believed was the love of his life.
by the end of this video,
You'll understand exactly what she'd been hiding, and exactly why. On the single happiest day of his life, he chose to run.
to understand why this moment broke Ethan the way it did,
You have to understand who he was before he ever met Claire Whitman.
Ethan grew up in a small town outside Portland, Oregon, the middle child of 3.
Raised by a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked construction, his childhood wasn't glamorous.
But it was stable dinner at 6, church on Sundays.
Homework at the kitchen table.
Stability wasn't just a
Preference for Ethan. It was.
something he'd built his entire identity around.
Largely because of what happened when he was 19. That year, Ethan's college.
Girlfriend of 2 years, his first serious relationship was revealed to have been
Living a kind of double life. Not cheating in the traditional sense,
but something almost stranger. She'd been telling 2 different friend groups 2 different versions of who she was,
exaggerating her family's wealth to one circle and downplaying it to another, borrowing money from people she barely knew under false pretenses.
When it all unraveled, Ethan wasn't just heartbroken.
He was humiliated.
He had introduced her to his family.
He had defended her to friends who'd raised concerns. From that point on, Ethan built his adult life around one unspoken rule.
Never again would he let himself be blindsided. He became, by his own admission, a careful person, a planner.
He asked questions others might consider too direct. He noticed inconsistencies. Friends sometimes teased him for being the human lie detector of the group.
So when people later asked how someone as sharp as
Ethan could have missed the signs with Claire,
the answer isn't that he wasn't paying attention.
it's that Claire was, in almost every way, the opposite of every red flag he trained himself to watch for. She was consistent. She was patient. She never once made him feel like he was asking too many questions, which, as you'll see, made what eventually happened even harder to see coming. Ethan met Claire Whitman 3 years before the wedding, at a backyard barbecue thrown by a mutual friend.
Named Priya, he remembers the exact moment.
Claire was standing near the drinks table,
Laughing at something,
wearing a slightly too formal blouse for a backyard party.
looking a little out of place, and somehow completely comfortable with that fact. She worked in finance, specifically in commercial lending, and had,
According to Priya, just moved back to Portland after a few complicated years in Denver.
they talked for almost 2 hours that first night.
Mostly about nothing books, hiking trails.
A shared dislike of pineapple on pizza.
Claire was easy to talk to in a way that felt rare. She asked good questions. She remembered small details from earlier in the conversation and brought
Them back up later, which made Ethan feel truly listened to.
over the following months. Their relationship developed at what
Ethan now describes as the perfect pace, not rushed, not stagnant. Claire met his parents around month 4.
she remembered his mother's birthday without being reminded. She showed up consistently in the small ways that matter more than grand gestures.
Driving 2 hours to help him move apartments. Sitting with him at the hospital when his grandfather had a minor surgery. Learning to make his favorite childhood recipe from his mother over a shaky video call.
By month 8, Ethan's guard, the one he'd built at 19, had almost entirely come down.
Not recklessly. He still noticed things.
He just kept concluding, each time.
That Claire had a reasonable explanation, because she always did.
Here's where it's worth being honest about the details. Ethan now looks back on differently.
The first was small. A folder on Claire's laptop.
Visible for just a second when she opened it to show him vacation photos.
Labeled simply DS, he asked about it, half joking. She said it was old work documents from a previous job. Nothing interesting, and closed the laptop a beat faster than felt natural.
Ethan let it go. The second was about Denver. Whenever the conversation turned to those 2
Years she'd spent there, roughly ages 26 to 28. Claire's answers grew noticeably shorter.
she'd say she needed a change of scenery or that it was a rough chapter without elaborating, and would gently steer the conversation elsewhere. Ethan, respecting what he assumed was some private pain, a bad breakup.
Maybe, or a difficult job never pushed. The third happened at Christmas, roughly a year and a half into the relationship.
Claire's phone rang during dinner at Ethan's parents' house. She glanced at the screen. excused herself, and stepped onto the back porch
for what she described afterward as a work
call about a loan closing. It was a Sunday. Ethan noticed but said nothing,
telling himself that finance people sometimes did get calls at odd hours. Individually, none of these moments seemed significant. Even together, they formed less of a pattern and more of a faint outline, the kind of thing you only recognize in hindsight.
Once you already know what was being hidden. There was also, importantly, a person who did try to say something.
Claire's college roommate, Marissa, who would later become her maid of honor, once told Ethan,
half joking at a dinner party, "Just promise me if she ever brings up Denver, you will actually ask her about it properly." At the time, Ethan laughed it off as an inside joke between old friends.
Looking back, he wonders if it was Marissa's clumsy,
loyalty-torn way of trying to nudge him toward a conversation she couldn't have herself. Ethan proposed 2 years and 2 months into their relationship
on a hiking trail overlooking the Oregon coast, a spot Claire had mentioned once, almost a year earlier, as her favorite place in the world. He'd remembered. He got down on one knee, hands visibly shaking,
and asked her to marry him before he'd even fully caught his breath from the climb.
Claire said yes before he finished the sentence.
The 14 months that followed were consumed by wedding planning.
They chose a vineyard venue an hour outside the city, with string lights strung between old oak trees and a barn that had been converted into an elegant reception space.
Claire handled most of the details on her side, her mother's help with the flowers,
her sister as maid of honor, a lace veil borrowed from an aunt for the occasion.
Ethan managed the guest list on his side,
his parents, a handful of co-workers, and a small group of college friends,
Marcus among them, who would serve as his best man.
Throughout the planning, nothing seemed unusual.
If anything, Claire seemed more present than ever, showing up to cake tastings,
weighing in on seating charts,
tearing up during their final dress rehearsal of the vows. Ethan's mother, not an easy woman to impress,
told him privately, "I've never seen you this settled with anyone."
Ethan believed her. He believed completely that he had found the safe,
steady life he'd promised himself at 19 he would one day build.
The morning of the wedding began the way every groom hopes it will. Ethan woke up in a cabin at the venue, surrounded by his father, his brother, and Marcus, a small speaker playing an old playlist from college in the background. His barber-turned-groomsman trimmed his beard at 9.
By 11, Ethan stood in front of a full-length mirror in his tuxedo,
jacket freshly pressed, and felt, for a long, quiet moment, completely and uncomplicatedly happy.
Claire, meanwhile, was getting ready in a separate suite on the property with her sister, Marissa, and 2 other bridesmaids.
Later, a groomsman would mention to Ethan that Claire had seemed a little quiet that morning, not upset, just distracted, checking her phone more than usual. At the time, everyone assumed it was ordinary wedding day nerves. The ceremony began at 4 in the afternoon.
Outdoors, beneath an arch wrapped in white roses,
Claire's father walked her down the aisle. Ethan remembers watching them approach,
his own hands trembling slightly at his sides.
When Claire reached the end of the aisle and their eyes met,
Ethan was already crying real tears, not performed ones, the kind that come from somewhere involuntary.
They had written their own vows. Ethan's included a line about how
Claire had shown him what safety feels like, a callback, though the guests didn't know it,
to everything he'd built his adult life to protect himself from. Claire's vows were shorter, simpler,
and included a line that guests would later remember uncomfortably.
"Ethan, you deserve a woman with nothing left to hide."
At the time, it read as a romantic declaration. In hindsight, it reads like a confession she hadn't yet found the courage to make.
The reception moved into the vineyard's barn as the sun went down.
String lights flickered on overhead. Dinner was served, a plated meal of salmon and short rib,
Ethan's favorite from the tasting months earlier. Toasts began around 7:30. Ethan's brother spoke first,
followed by Claire's father, who managed to get through his entire speech without crying, a fact he'd later joke about for months. Then came Marissa's maid of honor speech.
It started warmly enough stories about Claire in college, a joke about her terrible taste in shoes.
But partway through, Marissa said something that landed strangely in the room.
Claire's had, let's say,
an eventful path to get here.
Tonight, but I've never seen her more sure of anything than she is about. Ethan, a few guests laughed,
assuming it referred to some ordinary baccalaureate era mishap.
Ethan laughed too. He had no idea how literal that sentence actually was.
Dancing began around 8.
Claire's phone sat face down on the head table beside her water glass. While she danced, the mother-daughter no. The father-daughter danced with her own father, both of them laughing through half the song. Ethan watched from his seat, genuinely, fully happy, the happiest,
he'd later say, he had ever felt in his entire life.
It was 8:40 p.m.
According to the small watch Claire had given him as a wedding gift that morning, when her phone began to buzz.
The first buzz he noticed but ignored phones was constantly at weddings. Congratulations texts pouring in from people who couldn't attend. But it buzzed a second time, a third, insistently. The way a phone does when someone is calling repeatedly, not just texting. Ethan wasn't trying to snoop. He genuinely wasn't. But the screen
lit up face up for a brief second as it slid slightly on the table, and out of the same simple habit
any of us have when a
phone won't stop going off beside us. He glanced at it.
Claire, please. He has a right to know before you do this. Call me back. No name, just a number he didn't recognize, with a Colorado area code. Ethan's stomach tightened.
But he told himself it was probably nothing, a wrong number, an overly persistent coworker.
Maybe even a delivery issue with the honeymoon flights. He set the phone back down, face up this time without quite realizing it, and tried to refocus on the party.
5 minutes later, it buzzed again.
If you don't tell him, I will. This isn't fair to either of us. That was the moment Ethan's hands went cold. Not because of what the message said exactly.
It was vague enough to mean almost
anything but because of the word him. Someone, urgently, on his wedding night,
was talking about telling him something.
And it wasn't a stranger's him. It was Ethan's.
He sat very still for a moment,
watching Claire across the dance floor,
laughing, oblivious, glowing with the particular
happiness of a woman who believes the hardest part of her day is already behind her. He waited until she sat back down,
breathless and smiling from the dance floor.
Reaching automatically for her water glass, he asked her quietly, calmly, his voice steadier than he felt who was texting her.
Her face changed instantly.
Not confusion, not the mild irritation of someone interrupted mid
celebration, recognition, the specific, sinking look of a woman who has been waiting for a long time
for a conversation she had hoped would never actually arrive.
She asked to step outside to talk.
Ethan said no.
Some instinct in him the same.
Instinct that had once made him the
human lie detector of his friend group. The instinct he'd quieted for 3 years in the name of trust told him that whatever this was,
it needed to happen in the light, not smoothed over quietly in some dim corner of the parking lot. So he pressed her, right there at the head table, the DJ still playing, guests still dancing 20 feet away,
unaware that anything had shifted.
And Claire told him the truth. 8 years earlier, during those 2 complicated years in Denver, the years she'd always kept vague, Claire had been married, briefly, quietly, to a man named
Daniel Shaw. The marriage had lasted less than a year before they separated. But here was the detail that made Ethan's ears begin to ring.
The divorce had never been legally finalized.
Claire had believed, for years, that a filing submitted by her lawyer at the time had gone through.
It hadn't. Paperwork had been lost in an office relocation. A signature page had never been filed correctly.
Daniel had only recently discovered the same thing himself, while gathering documents for an unrelated loan application, and had been trying to reach
Claire for nearly 3 weeks to sort it out before the wedding. Calls and texts he had been quietly
declining and deleting.
In other words, as far as the state of Colorado was concerned, Claire
Whitman had still been legally married to someone else when she stood at that altar 3 hours earlier and promised Ethan nothing left to hide. She hadn't lied to trap him. She insisted, her voice cracking. She hadn't known, not for certain.
Not until Daniel's first message arrived 2.5 weeks ago. She told herself she could fix it quietly after the wedding,
file an emergency correction, and never have to burden Ethan with something that felt, in her mind, like an old administrative mistake rather than a real secret.
But Ethan wasn't hearing administrative mistake. He was hearing that the woman he had just promised his entire life to had known for over 2 weeks that their wedding might not
even be legally valid, and had chosen to walk down that aisle anyway, look him in the eyes,
and let him say vows about safety and
trust to a woman who was actively concealing the single largest secret of her life. She hadn't just kept a secret about her past.
She had let him marry a lie, in real time, on purpose. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't cry, not yet.
He stood up slowly,
in front of 200 people,
who had gone quiet,
enough to hear the ice machine humming in the corner of the barn, and he reached up and loosened his bow tie, pulling it free from his collar.
He set it down gently on the white tablecloth, smoothing it once with his palm, almost tenderly.
As if it were the only thing in the room he still trusted himself to be gentle with.
Then he pushed back his chair and walked out the front doors of the barn.
Claire called after him, her voice cracking on his name. His father started to follow, then stopped. seeing something in his son's face that told him not to.
Ethan kept walking, past confused guests,
Out through the gravel parking lot,
past the getaway car decorated with tin cans and a hand-painted
just married sign that suddenly felt like the cruelest joke he had ever seen.
He called his best friend, Marcus, his best man, still in his own tuxedo somewhere back inside, who caught up to him on foot before
Ethan even finished dialing and simply said, "I've got my keys. Let's go." Ethan sat down on the curb outside the vineyard,
tuxedo jacket discarded on the gravel beside him, and waited in the dark,
guests trickled out slowly behind him.
unsure whether to approach or give him space. Most show space.
Marissa came out once, stood a few feet away, and said quietly,
"I should have told you about Denver myself a long time ago. I'm sorry."
Ethan didn't answer her. He wasn't ready to.
When Marcus's car finally pulled up,
Ethan stood up, walked to the car,
and didn't look back at the barn even once. The days that followed were, in Ethan's words, a blur of paperwork and silence, because the marriage had never been legally valid to begin with. Claire's prior marriage to Daniel had technically still been in effect. Ethan's situation resolved through an annulment rather than a divorce,
finalized within a few months with comparatively little legal complexity.
Claire reached out several times in the weeks after,
insisting the paperwork error itself had genuinely been an honest mistake,
that she had only wanted to spare him unnecessary worry,
that she'd planned to fix everything
quietly and tell him the full story once it was resolved.
Ethan doesn't entirely dispute that the original clerical error was likely real, but the silence, the 8 years of never once mentioning a prior marriage,
and especially the 2.5 weeks of knowing,
in the lead up to their wedding,
that something was deeply wrong and choosing to walk down the aisle anyway, that hadn't been an accident.
That had been a choice made and remade. Every single day she didn't tell him. Ethan's family, initially in shock, rallied around him almost immediately.
His mother,
who had told him before the wedding that she'd never seen him this settled, later admitted she wished she'd
asked more questions about those quiet years in Denver herself.
A year later, Ethan says he doesn't regret walking out that night, not for 1 second.
Not even during the hardest weeks that followed. He says the version of himself that might have stayed,
who might have swallowed the humiliation to avoid an awkward scene in front of 200 guests,
wouldn't have respected himself by morning. He's back to his job as a high school history teacher outside Portland. He's started dating again, slowly and carefully, though this time with a different rule than the one he made at 19. Back then, his rule was never let yourself be blindsided. Now, he says, his rule is simpler.
If something feels vague, ask about it twice, not once, and pay attention not just to what someone says, but to how quickly they change the subject. He and Marissa, oddly enough, stayed in touch. She was the one person from that night who reached out consistently afterward, not to defend Claire, but simply to check on him.
He says he's forgiven her for not saying more,
sooner recognizing that loyalty to an old friend can sometimes make good.
People stay quiet about things they shouldn't. As for Claire,
Ethan heard secondhand that she
eventually resolved things with
Daniel and finalized the old divorce properly. What she did after that, he says, isn't really his story to tell anymore.
If this story affected you the way it affected us,
let us know in the comments below and tell us honestly.
Would you have confronted her right there at the table, the way Ethan did, or waited until you were somewhere private? If you want more real, unfiltered stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because we post a new one every single week.